I remember sitting across from someone who had spent years terrified of one book, not because they had actually read it from beginning to end, but because they had absorbed countless images, sermons, movies, conversations, and warnings about it. Every mention of Revelation immediately triggered the same mental picture: fire falling from the sky, monsters rising from the sea, secret codes hidden inside headlines, world leaders becoming villains overnight, numbers that supposedly explained every crisis, every earthquake, every war, every new technology suddenly became another sign that the end had finally arrived. Maybe you have experienced something similar. Maybe every time someone mentioned Revelation, your mind skipped directly to fear before it ever reached curiosity. That reaction alone should make you pause. Because whenever an entire culture reacts emotionally to a text, before examining what the text actually is, psychology has already taken over long before careful reading begins. The uncomfortable possibility is that most people do not fear Revelation because of what it says. They fear Revelation because of what they have been told it says. Those are not the same thing. And that distinction changes everything. Think about how often this happens outside religion. Someone tells you a coworker is difficult before you ever meet them. Now every awkward interaction confirms the warning. Someone says a movie is terrible before you watch it. Suddenly every flaw feels larger than it actually is. Someone labels another person dangerous, arrogant, dishonest, or brilliant, and your brain unconsciously begins collecting evidence that supports the label while quietly ignoring everything that challenges it. Psychologists have studied this tendency for decades. Once an expectation is planted, perception follows. Human beings rarely approach information with an empty mind. We approach it with invisible filters built from family, community, tradition, fear, and repetition. Revelation may be one of the greatest examples of this phenomenon ever produced. Before opening its first chapter, millions already believe they know what the entire book means. But where did those meanings come from? Did they come directly from the text itself? Or did they arrive through centuries of interpretation, layered upon interpretation, until the original document became almost impossible to see beneath the weight of inherited assumptions? Imagine finding an old family photograph that has been copied hundreds of times. Each generation adjusts the colors a little. Someone sharpens it. Someone crops it. Someone adds handwritten notes. Another person restores parts they think were damaged. Eventually, you are no longer looking at the original photograph. You are looking at generations of people interacting with it. Something similar may have happened with Revelation in the minds of countless readers. The irony is almost painful. A book whose very title means unveiling or revealing has become, for many people, the most misunderstood and mysterious book imaginable. The name itself comes from a Greek word that suggests the removal of a covering, the uncovering of something previously hidden. Yet culturally, the book has become associated with confusion instead of clarity. That contradiction alone deserves attention. What if the greatest misunderstanding begins before chapter 1? Most modern readers instinctively treat Revelation as though it were written directly to them about events taking place in their own century. But historically, that assumption is far from obvious. The opening lines identify an author, writing to 7 actual churches in a specific historical setting, under very real pressures. Those communities lived under the shadow of the Roman Empire. They faced political realities, social exclusion, economic challenges, and questions about loyalty that were immediate, not hypothetical. Whatever else Revelation may communicate, it first entered a world that already existed. Those first readers were not staring at smartphones, satellites, artificial intelligence, or global financial networks. They were navigating an empire that dominated nearly every aspect of life. This does not automatically determine how every symbol should be interpreted, but it forces an uncomfortable question. If the book was completely incomprehensible to its original audience, yet somehow perfectly understandable only 2,000 years later, what kind of communication would that be? Historians often ask a simple question before interpreting any ancient document. What would the first recipients have reasonably understood? That question does not solve every debate, but ignoring it creates entirely new problems. Here, psychology quietly enters again. Human beings have a remarkable tendency to believe that their generation occupies the center of history. Every age feels unique. Every crisis feels unprecedented. Every conflict appears to signal that everything is about to change forever. During pandemics, people search revelation. During wars, people search revelation. During economic collapse, people search revelation. During technological revolutions, people search revelation. During political instability, people search revelation. Each generation confidently identifies its own enemies, inventions, and leaders inside symbols that previous generations identified very differently. Medieval Europeans found themselves in revelation. Reformers found themselves in revelation. Victorians found themselves in revelation. People during both world wars found themselves in revelation. Cold War citizens found themselves in revelation. Modern audiences continue doing exactly the same thing. Notice the pattern. The symbols remain remarkably flexible, while human certainty remains remarkably constant. That should make us more cautious, not more confident. This does not mean the book lacks meaning. It means our own historical location may influence our reading more than we realize. We often assume we are discovering the text when, in reality, we may be discovering ourselves reflected inside it. That is one of the oldest psychological traps humanity knows. We mistake projection for interpretation. Consider another detail that often goes unnoticed. Revelation belongs to a style of literature unfamiliar to most modern readers. Its world is filled with symbolic numbers, cosmic imagery, fantastic creatures, dramatic visions, and layered references to earlier Hebrew scriptures. To many ancient audiences, this language was not strange at all. Symbolic storytelling was a recognized way of communicating profound ideas during periods of oppression and uncertainty. Modern readers, however, frequently approach it as though every image were intended as a literal newspaper prediction waiting to unfold in sequence. Imagine reading poetry with the expectations you bring to an engineering manual. The misunderstanding would begin immediately. That does not mean poetry cannot describe reality. It means its method of describing reality differs from technical writing. Revelation constantly echoes earlier biblical books, especially prophetic writings filled with symbolic language. Its images often build upon earlier traditions rather than introducing entirely new concepts. Yet many readers encounter Revelation in isolation, detached from the literary world that shaped it. The result resembles walking into the final chapter of a long novel without reading anything that came before. Every character appears mysterious because their history has been forgotten. Another fascinating psychological pattern emerges when fear dominates interpretation. Fear narrows attention. It trains the brain to prioritize threats over context. Once fear becomes the primary lens, every symbol transforms into a warning, while every ambiguity becomes evidence of impending catastrophe. This is not unique to religion. It happens in politics, economics, health, relationships, and media consumption. When people become anxious, they naturally search for patterns. Sometimes those patterns genuinely exist. Sometimes they are products of an overstimulated mind desperate for certainty. Neuroscientists describe the human brain as a prediction machine. It constantly anticipates what comes next because prediction increases survival. The downside is that the same machinery can connect unrelated events into persuasive stories. Revelation has often become the perfect canvas for this instinct because symbolic texts invite interpretation. The more ambiguous the symbol, the easier it becomes to attach contemporary meaning to it. Yet ambiguity should inspire humility rather than absolute confidence. There is another assumption worth questioning. Many people believe Revelation exists primarily to satisfy curiosity about future events. But what if curiosity about timelines was never its central concern? Many scholars argue that the book functions more as a theological vision about faithfulness, perseverance, justice, worship, empire, hope, and ultimate allegiance than as a detailed chronological roadmap. That does not eliminate disagreements about prophecy. Those disagreements remain significant and continue across many traditions. But shifting the question from when will these exact events happen to what kind of reality is this vision trying to reveal changes the conversation dramatically. Suddenly, revelation becomes less about decoding tomorrow's headlines and more about examining today's loyalties. Which powers shape your identity? Which fears control your decisions? What do you worship without realizing it? How easily do comfort, status, wealth, nationalism, or social acceptance become substitutes for deeper convictions? Those questions reach far beyond debates about chronology. They confront every generation equally. They refuse to remain trapped inside one century. That possibility makes revelation simultaneously less sensational and more personally challenging. It is easier to speculate about mysterious beasts than to examine your own heart. It is easier to identify villains somewhere else than to recognize the subtle ways power influences your own thinking. Throughout history, readers have often preferred prediction over introspection because prediction feels exciting while introspection feels uncomfortable. Yet uncomfortable reflection may be precisely where the text directs its greatest force. The irony grows even deeper when we realize how much modern culture profits from fear. Fear attracts attention. Attention creates audiences. Audiences generate influence. Whether in news, politics, entertainment, or religious media, frightening narratives spread faster than careful nuance. Revelation has repeatedly become material for industries built upon urgency. Every decade produces confident interpreters who declare that this time the evidence is undeniable. Some sincerely believe their conclusions, others recognize that certainty sells. Either way, the audience often receives emotional intensity instead of intellectual honesty. Genuine scholarship usually sounds less dramatic. It acknowledges competing interpretations. It distinguishes historical evidence from theological conviction. It recognizes complexity without abandoning conviction. That approach rarely goes viral because uncertainty feels unsatisfying. Yet reality often refuses to fit inside simple slogans. Perhaps the deepest lesson hidden beneath all these debates has little to do with identifying specific symbols and everything to do with recognizing ourselves. Why are we so eager for certainty? Why do we crave systems that explain every crisis? Why does ambiguity make us uncomfortable? Revelation may expose something larger than future events. It may expose the human condition itself. We long for control in a world that repeatedly reminds us we possess very little of it. We search for patterns because randomness frightens us. We attach ourselves to communities that reinforce our interpretations because belonging feels safer than questioning. None of this proves one interpretation correct or another false. It simply reminds us that reading any profound text requires more than intelligence. It requires humility. If this conversation challenged assumptions you have carried for years, stay with this journey. Subscribe not because certainty has been handed to you, but because asking better questions is often the first step towards seeing more clearly. I want to believe that if I had lived in another century, I would have interpreted Revelation differently. Most people think that about themselves. We imagine we would have been more objective than those who came before us. We laugh at medieval predictions that confidently identified the end of the world. We shake our heads at 19th century interpreters who believed industrial inventions fulfilled ancient prophecies. We smile at newspaper clippings from the 20th century, claiming that a particular political leader, economic alliance, or military conflict was unquestionably the final sign before history ended. Yet the uncomfortable possibility is that future generations may look at our own interpretations with exactly the same mixture of curiosity and disbelief. That realization should not make us cynical. It should make us careful. One of the most powerful psychological biases human beings possess is chronological arrogance, the quiet assumption that our generation finally sees clearly while previous generations were trapped by ignorance. History repeatedly exposes how fragile that confidence can be. Every age believes it stands at the climax of history because every age experiences uncertainty as if it were unprecedented. Every generation experiences wars that feel unlike any before them. Every generation believes technology has fundamentally altered reality. Every generation witnesses political instability that appears impossible to recover from. Every generation feels that morality is collapsing in ways never previously imagined. and every generation can find language inside Revelation that seems to describe its own moment with astonishing precision. The question is not whether the parallels are interesting. The question is why the same process keeps happening across 2,000 years. That recurring pattern deserves just as much attention as any individual interpretation. Think about how memory works. You do not remember every detail of your childhood equally. Your brain highlights moments that fit the story you currently tell yourself about who you are. The same selective process happens when reading complex texts. If someone approaches Revelation expecting to find evidence that the modern world is uniquely corrupt, their attention naturally gravitates toward passages that reinforce that expectation. If someone approaches it expecting hope, they notice different themes. If someone approaches it as resistance literature written to oppressed communities under imperial rule, entirely different patterns emerge. None of these readers are necessarily dishonest. They are simply human. The brain is not a passive recording device. It is an active meaning-making machine. It constantly filters information through existing beliefs, emotional experiences, and social identity. This is why two intelligent people can read the same passage and leave with radically different conclusions, while each feels completely convinced that the text speaks for itself. Often what feels like the plain meaning of a text is actually the invisible partnership between the words on the page and the assumptions already living inside the reader. That realization becomes even more significant when we examine how Revelation actually communicates. The book rarely explains every image with mathematical precision. Instead, it layers symbols upon symbols, echoes earlier biblical language, and invites readers into a world where meaning is discovered through patterns rather than isolated definitions. Modern Western culture often prefers instruction manuals. We want every symbol decoded into one permanent answer. Ancient apocalyptic literature frequently works differently. It paints enormous pictures intended to reshape imagination before it satisfies curiosity. It challenges the reader's vision of reality rather than merely providing information. That distinction matters because information changes what you know, while imagination changes how you see. Revelation repeatedly asks readers to see beyond appearances. Empires appear invincible, yet they fall. Wealth appears permanent, yet it disappears. Violence appears victorious, yet its victories prove temporary. Power appears absolute, yet it remains accountable to something greater. Whether one reads these themes through theological belief, literary analysis, or historical reflection, the repeated contrast between appearance and reality becomes difficult to ignore. This may explain why Revelation continues attracting readers across radically different cultures. Its imagery is dramatic, but beneath the drama lies an enduring psychological question. What story about reality are you trusting? Every society tells stories that define success, security, and meaning. Ancient Rome told one story. Modern consumer culture tells another. Political ideologies tell others. National identities tell still more. Most people rarely notice these narratives because they grow up surrounded by them. They become the mental background music of everyday life. Revelation consistently challenges dominant stories about power and asks whether the world's apparent rulers truly possess ultimate authority. Even readers who reject its theological claims often recognize that this challenge to unquestioned systems remains psychologically relevant. Human beings repeatedly mistake temporary dominance for permanent truth. We assume today's structures will last forever because they are all we have ever known. History repeatedly proves otherwise. Another overlooked feature of Revelation is that it spends remarkable attention on worship. That may sound purely religious, but worship in a broader psychological sense involves whatever occupies our highest loyalty, deepest trust, and greatest devotion. Every human being organizes life around something. For some, it is wealth. For others, reputation. For others, ideology, family, achievement, pleasure, political identity, or social acceptance. Even those who reject organized religion still construct hierarchies of value. The question is not whether you worship in this broader sense. The question is what occupies the center. Revelation repeatedly contrasts competing objects of ultimate allegiance. Whether interpreted literally, symbolically, historically, or theologically, this recurring theme pushes beyond speculation about future events into everyday human experience. What quietly shapes your decisions? What fear most easily controls you? What would you refuse to lose at almost any cost? Those questions feel far less comfortable than identifying symbolic creatures in ancient visions because they leave nowhere to hide. It is also worth noticing what happens whenever Revelation becomes primarily a puzzle book. People begin chasing hidden codes while overlooking visible principles. Endless debates emerge over dates, numbers, geopolitical alliances, technological inventions, and speculative scenarios. Meanwhile, themes like endurance, integrity, courage, justice, humility, and faithfulness often receive surprisingly little attention, despite occupying substantial space within the text itself. This imbalance reflects another familiar human tendency. Mystery attracts attention more easily than character. Solving secrets feels intellectually satisfying. Examining ourselves feels emotionally demanding. Yet throughout history, societies have often been destroyed less by misunderstood predictions than by ordinary greed, pride, corruption, hatred, and indifference. Revelation's symbolic world repeatedly points toward these deeper moral realities, regardless of where one stands on questions of prophecy. There is something else that deserves reflection. Fear has extraordinary persuasive power because it promises certainty in exchange for obedience. Throughout history, fear has united movements, justified violence, silenced criticism, and strengthened institutions. Religious communities are not immune to this dynamic, nor are secular ones. Whenever people become convinced that questioning an interpretation is equivalent to betraying truth itself, conversation begins to disappear. Identity replaces inquiry. Loyalty replaces curiosity. Revelation has sometimes been used within this psychological framework, not because the text demands it, but because human beings naturally seek certainty during periods of instability. Once certainty becomes part of group identity, changing one's mind feels emotionally dangerous. You are no longer reconsidering an interpretation. You are risking relationships, reputation, and belonging. That emotional cost explains why deeply held beliefs often survive, even when evidence becomes complicated. Human beings protect identity with remarkable determination. Perhaps this is why genuine intellectual humility feels so rare. Humility is often misunderstood as weakness or indecision. In reality, it is the willingness to distinguish confidence from certainty. A person may hold convictions strongly while still recognizing the limits of personal understanding. Revelation itself has generated sincere disagreement among devoted readers for centuries. Scholars, historians, theologians, philosophers, and ordinary believers continue reaching different conclusions while studying the same text with great seriousness. That historical reality should encourage patience rather than arrogance. If thoughtful people across generations have disagreed, perhaps confidence should be accompanied by the awareness that complexity is not a flaw to eliminate, but a reality to acknowledge. The deepest challenge may not be discovering what every symbol means. It may be recognizing why we are so eager for final answers in the first place. Human beings are uncomfortable with uncertainty because uncertainty reminds us of our vulnerability. We cannot fully predict tomorrow. We cannot control history. We cannot guarantee justice arrives on our preferred timetable. We cannot eliminate suffering through interpretation alone. Revelation, regardless of one's conclusions about its prophetic dimensions, confronts readers with a world where appearances deceive, power shifts, empires fade, and ultimate meaning cannot be reduced to immediate circumstances. That message has remained surprisingly resilient, precisely because every generation encounters its own version of uncertainty. If there is one assumption worth carrying forward, it is this: reading Revelation responsibly requires more than imagination, more than intelligence, and more than confidence. It requires the willingness to examine not only the text, but also the invisible assumptions we bring to it. Sometimes the greatest revelation is not hidden inside the symbols, it is hidden inside the reader. There is a quiet irony that many readers never notice. The final book of the Bible has often been treated as though its greatest purpose were to help people predict the future with increasing precision. Yet, the more history unfolds, the more that confidence has repeatedly collided with reality. Dates have come and gone, predictions have risen and fallen, entire interpretive systems that once seemed unshakable have gradually been abandoned, revised or replaced. Still, the cycle continues. That persistence tells us something important about human nature. We are not simply attracted to certainty because certainty is true. We are attracted to certainty because uncertainty is emotionally exhausting. A detailed explanation of the future feels like protection against anxiety. If we believe we know exactly what comes next, then perhaps we can stop feeling vulnerable. The problem is that vulnerability is part of the human condition. No interpretation, religious or secular, completely removes it. We still wake up not knowing what tomorrow holds. We still experience loss without warning. We still struggle with injustice that remains unresolved. We still confront questions that refuse to fit neatly into our preferred explanations. Perhaps this is one reason Revelation has remained so compelling across centuries. It speaks to people living in uncertainty rather than pretending uncertainty does not exist. Whether one approaches the book through faith, historical inquiry, literary criticism, or philosophical reflection, one reality remains unmistakable. It was written for people who felt surrounded by forces larger than themselves. That experience has never disappeared. Every generation has its own empire. Every generation has its own fears. Every generation believes the pressures it faces are unlike any before. And every generation must decide whether fear will become its primary interpreter of reality. That decision reaches far beyond theology. It shapes politics, relationships, careers, communities, and even personal identity. The stories we believe determine the lives we build. This is why Revelation continues provoking such passionate reactions. It is not merely a book about dramatic visions. It is a book that asks what kind of world you believe you are living in. Is history ultimately meaningless, driven only by power and chance? Is justice merely an illusion invented by those who cannot accept reality? Or is there a deeper order that cannot always be seen from the perspective of the present moment? Those questions remain alive, regardless of where someone lands on questions of doctrine. They are philosophical questions as much as theological ones. They shape civilizations because they shape expectations. A person convinced that power alone determines history behaves differently from someone convinced that moral accountability ultimately matters. A society that believes nothing exists beyond immediate survival develops different values than one convinced human actions possess lasting significance. Revelation enters these conversations through symbols rather than systematic arguments, but symbols often reach places that abstract reasoning cannot. A vivid image can reshape imagination long before it settles intellectual debates. This may explain why the book continues generating discussion after nearly 2,000 years. It refuses to become merely historical, yet it also resists simplistic modern appropriation. It constantly challenges readers to ask whether they are seeing reality clearly or merely projecting contemporary anxieties onto ancient imagery. That question may be more important than identifying every symbol with complete confidence. Throughout history, human beings have repeatedly mistaken temporary certainty for permanent truth. Entire civilizations once considered themselves unstoppable before disappearing into history books. Financial systems believed to be unbreakable have collapsed. Political movements that seemed destined to last forever have vanished. Cultural assumptions accepted as unquestionable have been overturned within a single generation. Revelation repeatedly reminds readers that appearances are unstable. What seems permanent often proves temporary. What appears victorious may already contain the seeds of its own downfall. Whether interpreted through historical scholarship or theological conviction, that perspective encourages humility. It warns against confusing the present moment with the whole story. Humility, however, is difficult because it demands that we admit the limits of our perception. We naturally overestimate how much we understand. We interpret incomplete information with surprising confidence. We mistake familiarity for accuracy. We inherit assumptions so early in life that they begin feeling self-evident rather than learned. This applies equally to religious believers, skeptics, historians, philosophers, and everyone in between. No worldview exists in a psychological vacuum. Every worldview develops within families, cultures, educational systems, friendships, and communities. Recognizing that influence does not automatically invalidate our beliefs, but it should make us more thoughtful about how those beliefs formed. Revelation, perhaps more than almost any other biblical book, exposes the tension between inherited certainty and careful examination. It invites readers into a symbolic landscape that refuses to reward shallow reading. It slows down those willing to pay attention and frustrates those demanding immediate simplicity. That may be one of its greatest gifts. In an age addicted to instant conclusions, it resists becoming easily conquered. Instead, it continually asks readers to examine not only what they think, but why they think it. That is an uncomfortable exercise because identity is often woven into interpretation. Changing one's understanding can feel like betraying one's past, yet intellectual maturity has always involved the courage to follow evidence, context, and honest reflection wherever they lead, even when doing so complicates familiar narratives. This does not require abandoning conviction. It requires distinguishing conviction from inflexibility. The strongest ideas do not fear careful examination. They become clearer through it. The weakest ideas demand protection from every difficult question. Perhaps that is the greatest misunderstanding surrounding Revelation. The book has frequently been treated as though questioning common interpretations threatens its value. In reality, serious engagement often reveals dimensions overlooked by assumptions that have become too comfortable through repetition. Whether one ultimately embraces a traditional theological reading, a historical critical perspective, a symbolic interpretation, or another well-reasoned approach, the process of wrestling honestly with the text is itself valuable. It reminds us that truth is not strengthened by refusing questions, it is strengthened by surviving them. Maybe the title has been pointing towards something larger all along. An unveiling is not merely the disclosure of future events, it is the removal of illusion. Sometimes the illusion concerns power, sometimes identity, sometimes fear, sometimes certainty itself. And perhaps the most difficult illusion to surrender is the comforting belief that we have already finished learning. The moment we become convinced that every important question has already been settled, curiosity begins to die. When curiosity dies, genuine understanding rarely grows. The challenge, then, is not to read Revelation looking only for confirmation of what we already believe. The challenge is to read with enough honesty to recognize where our assumptions begin and where the text actually speaks. Those two things are not always identical. If this conversation has encouraged you to question inherited assumptions with greater care, to separate evidence from habit, and to value thoughtful inquiry over easy certainty, then continue exploring these questions with the same openness. The search for truth is rarely comfortable, but it is often where the deepest understanding begins.